Good afternoon. A little adjustment. I'm a little bit shorter here. It's been one of those weeks that you look back and wonder, no, not how I got over. I think we know that. You wonder what's happening. That little incident at the airport was just very indicative of what's happening. You've got a city where people have been walking around shooting each other just for whatever reason. And now here's a man that he finds out he gets transferred to, of all places, Hawaii, and decides, well, I don't want to go. Not only do I not want to go, nobody gets to fly anywhere. He throws gasoline, sets the ATF facility on fire, and jumps into the fire, slits his wrists. And he survived somehow. But unfortunately, the airport has been in a state of chaos ever since. But this isn't abnormal. It's the behavior is, but the source of it is not. You see, heading into these holy days, it's always been, at least for me personally, and I've talked to other people that have talked about it over the years, how there's always been a certain amount of trepidation on the part of seasoned believers, because our past experience has taught us that for every holy season of God, Satan makes it a point to make them as difficult as he possibly can. Doesn't do horrible things in a lot of cases. Sometimes it's just simple irritations. But other things are life-changing. I think about a family a few years ago that was driving down to the feast and in a caravan, and they had 9 children, and the children were in the car. The car flipped over, and all 9 children died, and they asked the father, well, what are you going to do? He says, we sent the bodies back to the morgue. They'll hold them until we get back. We're going to continue on, and we're going to keep the feast. And the world looked at them and said they were crazy. But this is what we deal with. Satan uses this time to make us doubt our calling. And if we are unsure, and unfortunately some believers are, we may not always open up and let that unsureness know. And sometimes we tend to, as we talk among each other, we hold things back. We've been told that we're supposed to talk to each other. That's because everybody, we're brought together for a reason. We're brought here to talk to each other. And perhaps if I've got a problem, maybe you've already gone through it. Or maybe if I've gone through something that you're going through, maybe I can give you a little advice, lighten the load a little bit, make it a little bit better for you. But sometimes we don't do that. We just kind of hold it in and deal with it. But what you got to understand is all of these things, when they happen, they bring up the one thing that we don't need: doubt. You see, the closest partner of weakened faith is doubt. And the ones with the most success in this walk of believers are those believers who are somehow able to dissolve this dangerous partnership between faith and doubt. And it is a dangerous partnership. Yeshua saw it in Peter, and we'll drop anchor here in the water for once. Matthew, the 14th chapter, the 22nd verse. Matthew, the 14th chapter, the 22nd verse, where it says, immediately he made the disciples get into the boat and go before him to the other side. And while he dismissed the crowds, after he had dismissed the crowds, he went up on the mountain by himself to pray. When evening came, he was there alone. But the boat by this time was a long way from the land, beaten by the waves, for the wind was against them. And in the fourth watch of the night, he came to them walking on the sea. But when the disciples saw him walking on the sea, they were terrified, said, "It's a ghost, it's a spirit." And they cried out in fear. But immediately Yeshua spoke to them, saying, "Take heart, it is I. Do not be afraid." And Peter answered him, "Lord, if it is you, command me to come to you on the water." And he said, "Come." So Peter got out of the boat and walked on the water and came to Yeshua. Whoa. But when he saw the wind, he was afraid. And beginning to sink, he cried out, "Lord, save me." Yeshua immediately reached out his hand and took hold of him, saying, "Oh, ye of little faith, why did you doubt? Why did you doubt?" No reason. I mean, he was walking already. He'd already started out. He was walking on the water. It didn't say he made one step and fell. He was in the motion. He was doing it. The doubt disconnected the faith. And then he began to sink. But you see, this is usually the pattern. You're full of zeal when you start off on this. You start to do this and you take the tasks in your heart. But suddenly, doubt arises in you and you falter. This is the pattern. Doubt, fear, fall. And coming up on the Day of Atonement and these last feasts, the Feast of Tabernacles and the last great day, this, I think, is as good a time as any to consider this walk more fully, in a deeper way, with deeper faith. For title, we'll call this one, Walk the Walk, but in faith. Walk the walk, but in faith. See, walking this walk, as we've seen so many times, is not easy. It's often made more difficult by a faithless world that we live in. A secular culture that is not exactly supportive of true faith. Oh, they like religion. They love religion. They're just not real crazy about true faith. They seem more willing to tolerate the faith spawned within its form and function, but the form and function of the world seems ready to rip true faith to shreds and never look back, because the world has its own God and its own faith, and it has forced it on to every other faith in the world in their own way. But this as well, when you think about it, has created doubt. Every Christian denomination on the planet praises his holy name. They love him unquestionably. Yet, what does the book left to us as instructions say about those who love him? Unfortunately, those commands were ignored and continue to be ignored by Jews and Gentiles alike. John, the 14th chapter, the 15th verse. This is where it gets very interesting, because these things are not things that you have to go to school for years to understand. These are not things that require a lot of formal education in theology. These are not things that children can understand if they read them fully. John, the 14th chapter, the 15th verse, where it says, "If you love me, you will keep my commandments." Very simple stuff here. Let's go down to verse 21. He elaborates on that a bit. "He who has my commandments and keeps them, he it is who loves me." Sometimes it's not so much what he says as what he doesn't say. He says, if these are those who love me, who are the others? And it's not our place to label them. He's already done that for us. We just have to not become big-headed in the effort. He says, if these love me, the others are possibly, well, we could throw some terminology around, but it's not worth that. And he who loves me shall be loved by my Father. And I will love him and will reveal myself to him. Judas, not Iscariot, said to him, Lord, how is it that you will reveal yourself to us and not to the world? What? Yeshua answered and said to him, if a man loves me, he will keep my word, and my Father will love him, and we will come to him and make our abode with him. The implication here is clear. If they don't keep my word, they merely give me lip service, not hip service. They talk the talk, but they don't walk the walk. And the question comes very quickly, what will they do when the fire comes? Because it won't be water next time. Matthew, the 15th chapter, the 7th verse, elaborates on this. We don't have to do so. Matthew, the 15th chapter, the 7th verse, where it says, hypocrites, well did Isaiah prophesy of you, saying, this people draws near to me with their mouth and honors me with their lips, but their their hearts are far from me. But in vain they worship me, teaching for doctrines the commandments of men. But this generation wasn't the first to do this. Oh no. This goes all the way back to Adam and Eve in the garden. And it moved on up to the newly freed Hebrews out heading toward the promised land. They were given an object lesson on how to keep the Sabbath, but I want you to watch what happened here. Let's go to Exodus, the 16th chapter, the 22nd verse. We always dance all around this during the spring holy days, but let's dance through it now. Matter of fact, let's walk across it. Exodus, the 16th chapter, the 22nd verse, where it says, and it happened on the 6th day, they gathered twice as much bread, 2 omers for one. And also the rulers of the congregation came and told Moses, and he said to them, this is that which Yahweh has said. Tomorrow is the rest of the holy Sabbath to Yahweh. Bake what you will today and boil what you will boil. And that which remains over, lay up for you to be kept until the morning. What he's telling you is do enough for 2 days and you'll be okay. And they laid it up until the morning, as Moses said, and it did not stink. Neither was there any worm in it. So it didn't spoil. And Moses said, eat that today, for today is a Sabbath to Yahweh. Today you shall not find it in the field. Pretty plain, huh? Pretty simple, right? Everybody got it, right? Wrong. 26. 26. There's always a few. 6 days you should gather it, but on the 7th day, the Sabbath, there shall be none. And it happened, some of the people went out on the 7th day in order to gather. Had to happen, huh? And they did not find any. And Yahweh said to Moses, how long do you refuse to keep my Sabbaths and my laws? See, because Yahweh has given you the Sabbath, therefore he gives you the bread of 2 days on the 6th day. Each one stay in his place. Let not anyone go out of his place on the 7th day. So the people rested on the 7th day. Now, In my eye, now, I'm not the brightest light in the world. I admit that. But it doesn't get much plainer than this. But and this is where the rub is, with over 3,800 denominations declaring Sunday the first day of the week is the Sabbath, I'd imagine that might set some doubt in the minds of those who only read the Bible when they go to church. We do, after all, live in a country that claims to be a democracy, therefore the majority tends to rule. Loyalty to tradition certainly can, in the face of this kind of opposition, engender doubt. It sets belief against tradition. Double-mindedness can be the quick result. The Apostle James spoke plainly of the problem with not being able to make up your mind. We are told to pray for the wisdom to make a firm decision. In James, the 1st chapter, the 5th verse. Won't be here long. James, the 1st chapter, the 5th verse. But if any of you lacks wisdom, let him ask of God, who gives to all liberally and with no reproach. You know how sometimes you ask somebody something, didn't you know that? With no reproach. And it shall be given to him. But let him ask in faith, doubting nothing. For he who doubts is like a wave of the sea, driven by the wind and tossed. For do not let that man think that he shall receive anything from the Lord. He is a double-minded man, undependable in all his ways. That's interesting. You hear people say, oh, well, he was wrong about that, but we can listen to him on that, so it's okay to listen and tune in from time to time. But it says, a double-minded man is not dependable in all his ways. If he's not dependable in all his ways, at what point can you listen to him? Just a question. Indecision in the face of conflicting information can make anyone nearly insane until they make up their mind. But be they wrong or be they right, this is why it's always best to do most of your decision making initially alone, with much meditation and prayer. And if you seek outside counsel, only trust those who show biblical wisdom about biblical things. And they have shown over time to be knowledgeable in these matters. You see, as we get close to the day, if you will, there's no time for waffling. There's no time for seeking unsound counsel. Oh, my friend so-and-so, he reads the Bible a little bit. Maybe he knows a little something. Maybe not. The times dictate that something of prophetic importance is in the wind. Something of prophetic importance is about to happen. There was a time in the Bible when Paul had advice on marriage because at this time he felt like these things were about to come down on them. He had his reasons, and I won't do that. I'm not going to tell you who you should marry and who you shouldn't. That's not my place. That's yours. But the Bible does have guidelines. But first, let's consider Paul's reasoning. He felt, and for his time it was true, that the church was under attack, and its saints were chased all through the countryside and persecuted. And because of this, he brought forth his reasoning. He says that and he said these things in a sexually charged pagan city where he was at the time, Corinth. I think we've heard about Corinth. But with some of the same attitudes and the same temptations that were in play in Corinth are right here and right now. So the guidelines that Paul laid out, let's at least consider them. 1 Corinthians, the 7th chapter, the 1st verse. 1 Corinthians, the 7th chapter, the 1st verse, where it says, "Now, concerning what you wrote to me, it is good for a man not to touch a woman. But because of the fornication, let each have his own wife." They were, after all, living in Corinth, which was a highly sexualized city, kind of like modern America, where it was in everything. It was in the music. Maybe not, they didn't have record players, but they had little bands that would stand on the corner and play little ribald little songs. It was the way it was. Don't let the media trip you up and think, oh, they didn't have iPods. No, they had live musicians, which can sometimes be more profound if you know anything. Watch children when they're listening, when they're in a school classroom situation, and you talk to them, and they have a little trouble memorizing, but sing it to them. Give it to them in a rhyme. It goes right in, and it tends to stick. That's the evil of rap music, for those who wonder. They put it in a rhyme, so you remember. You got you kids walking around talking about, it's rap it like it's, I don't even know what they're talking about. They have no idea what they're talking about, but they remember it. They remember it. All of this is all around us. Don't worry about the media. Don't worry about how it comes to us. Satan knows how to get evil to you. Believe me, he does. But he says in verse 3, let each have his own wife, and let each have her own husband. Let the husband give to the wife proper kindness, and likewise the wife also to the husband. The wife does not have authority over her own body, but the husband. And likewise also the husband does not have any authority over his wife, over his own body, but the wife. Do not deprive one another, unless it is with consent for a time, that you may give yourselves to fasting and prayer, and then come together again, so that Satan does not tempt you for your incontinence. Now I'm getting business a little bit, but what happens here is sometimes men and women will get angry and say, I want this, and if you don't do that, I'm going to cross my legs, so to speak. The Bible says, no, you don't do that. Not a good idea, because it opens temptation. Verse 6, but I speak this according to permission, not according to commandment. What he's saying, this is my opinion. I like about Paul, he makes very clear where he's coming from. This is what I say, based on what I see, based on what I know, based on what I've dealt with. And then when it gets to a point where it does become commandment, he makes it clear, this is the word of God. Verse 7, for I would that all men were even as I am. Single in this case. But each has his own proper gift from God, one according to this manner and another according to that. I say therefore to the unmarried and to the widows, it is good for them if they remain even as I. And you got to understand, he wasn't just saying this generally. Don't make this general information. He was talking about the people that were being chased from town to town and beaten and thrown into prison and separated, children tortured to get the family to change to the paganism that everybody else was brought around to them. It's a little bit different situation here. So don't take this and say, oh, Paul says you shouldn't in any circumstance. No, he was talking in a very specific circumstance, and once you get into that circumstance, you will probably understand it a little bit better. Verse 10, and to the married I command, not I, but the Lord. Notice the change. A woman not to be separated from her husband, but if she is indeed separated, let her remain unmarried, or be reconciled to her husband. And a husband is not to leave his wife, but to the rest I speak, not the Lord. If any brother has a wife who does not believe, and she is pleased to dwell with him, do not let him put her away. And the woman who has a husband who does not believe, if he is pleased to dwell with her, do not let her leave him. For the unbelieving husband is sanctified by the wife. Does that mean that they are fully vested in the church? No. They get the physical benefit, if you will. In other words, if you're protected from harm, he's protected from harm, so long as he lives within the marriage boundary. Once he slips outside of that, he's slipped away from his protection, if you will. So don't be surprised if something happens. You got to deal with these things honestly and the way that they're written here. And the unbelieving wife is sanctified by the husband, else your children would be unclean. But now they are holy. No, they're not baptized, but they're set aside just as you are. So long as they stay within the realm, you're all good. But, verse 15, if the unbelieving one separates, let him be separate. A brother or a sister is not in bondage in such cases, but God has called us in peace. In other words, if they disagree with your belief system to the point where it's causing that much problem and they want to go, let them go. But he says, this is my word, not God's. Be aware. Having friends in the faith, as I've said and written before, there are times when the unchurched husbands and wives have become a mental burden to their spouses. Know this: apart from your decision to follow Christ, marriage is the single most important decision you will ever make in your life. Make it wisely and make it very carefully. The obligations of both the marriage and the church. And not, when I say not necessarily the church, but the faith. Don't trip on the church. Don't trip on that. Because some churches ask for a whole lot more than they should. We don't, but some do. And sometimes they put things there that might cause you some problems that you would not normally have. But even in a case where it's not that much, if the husband or wife is not on board, if you will, with it, it can cause you some problems. The obligations of both the marriage and the church the faith, not the church. Let me just erase that church. Put faith there. The obligations of both the marriage and the faith will take your life in directions that will severely impact any problems in the marriage in which both parties do not respect and allow the obligations of both. You need a spouse who respects and understands fully your commitment and obligations to not so much the church, but the faith. But also your keeping above all else the law and the words of Yeshua. At some point, this will surely become a point of divisiveness for you both if your paths are divergent in any way. Many claim to be able to navigate this, but not without some challenge. We're not going to get visitors, are we? And few, as I said, navigate it without hitting the rocks at some point. And once these rocks are hit, decisions must be made which also will impact the eternities of both, believing or not. Of this, Paul gave this decision to the believer. Verse 16. For what do you know, O wife, whether you shall save your husband? Or what do you know, O man, whether you shall save your wife? But as God has distributed to each one, and as the Lord has called each one, so let each walk. And so I ordain in all the churches. He said, this is my opinion, this isn't God. In other words, you got to do what you got to do. He's just giving you a guideline based on what was going on at this time. But I say this, eventually it's going to happen again. These are huge decisions. And many make them lacking the foresight to recognize what could happen in the future. That's why you think with, how did an old guy tell me once? He said, you think with the head on the top of your head. Okay. Once religious persecution rears its satanic head in America, as it has in Africa, as it has in South America, as it has in the Middle East of Africa, as it has in Israel, as it has in China. We've heard all these stories. Some of us even read things like the book of the Legends of the Martyrs and the magazines, where they tell you about the things that go on in other countries where people are persecuted because of their faith. This hasn't happened here, but it's happening in China, Southeast Asia. A lot of these people that are sneaking up here from Mexico are leaving because of the persecution in Mexico. And there are other hotbeds of religious confusion and hatred all over the world. Marriages will become problematic if there's any unequal yoking. Paul, earlier in his travels through Corinth, also spoke of this. Let's go to 2 Corinthians, the 6th chapter, the 14th verse. 2 Corinthians, the 6th chapter, the 14th verse, where it says, do not be unequally yoked together with unbelievers. For what fellowship does righteousness have with lawlessness? And what partnership does light have with darkness? And what agreement does Christ have with Belial? Belial being satanic thoughts or evil thoughts. Or some even say he's Satan himself. Or what part does a believer have with an unbeliever? And what agreement does a temple of God have with idols? For you are the temple of the living God, as God has said, I will dwell in them and walk among them, and I will be their God, and they shall be my people. Now, I realize we don't live in an agrarian society or a farming society anymore. Let's maybe put some flesh on Paul's little metaphor there. A yoke is a wooden bar that links two oxen together, one end between the oxen, the other attached to the wagon or whatever it is that they happen to be pulling. In order to make that thing work, those oxen have to be equally yoked, which is a little bit different with animals than it is with people. Equally yoked with them means that each one has to be of about the same height, about the same weight, about the same size, and somewhere around the same age. Sometimes they will put the younger ones on with an older one because they kind of train each other. This is what we're supposed to do here. And they'll walk. You'll see them working within each other. The weaker or the shorter ox, if you mix them up wrong, would walk too slow over the taller one. Or the stronger one would pull too far to the one side or the other from the weaker one, and it would cause the load to either veer off to the right or the left, or you've seen them. I saw it in a movie once, I can't think of what it was, where the thing was just going around in circles. It was just going around in circles. They had to come out there and pull the one ox off and put a bigger one in there and see it go off straight. That was the best example I had. I was about 14, 15 when I saw that. And I cannot think for the life of me of the name of that movie. But it was the funniest thing. But in reading this at the time, it just stuck in my brain. Like, wow, that's what he's talking about here. You can't go straight if everybody's got their own agenda, if everybody's doing something different. When oxen are unequally yoked, they cannot perform the task set before them. Instead of working together, they're at odds with each other, frustrating both the person charged with transporting the load, and eventually even the oxen themselves will begin to wrestle to separate from each other, recognizing what they should be doing. They'll be chafing on the yoke. Especially if one is used to pulling carts and the other is not. When you look at this metaphor, the parallels are staggering. But marital problems can be extremely compromising to a believer, especially one who has a large role in the faith, but the spouse is not necessarily in agreement with this. This well may have been what Paul was referencing in allowing a split rather than the believer to compromise his faith for the sake of the unbelieving spouse. And like I said before, he was dealing with a hot situation. They were being chased from place to place, and some people weren't going to be dealing with that. Hey, I don't feel like running. I don't feel like breaking my house up and running just because you got to be running with your God. This also has caused issues where the believer has begun to doubt, believing that God would resolve the problem that they were aware of when they entered into the relationship, but this is one that is often a silent problem because the people, once they enter into the relationship and they're unaware of the larger implications of it until they become large. Then, how do I get out of this? How do I deal with it? And you just struggle through it. Now, once children are involved, it can become a nightmare. And we're blessed in that we have yet to see physical religious persecution as yet. Oh, they laugh at us, but we should be used to that. We should be very much used to that. But believe me, the other shoe will eventually drop. One reason is the attempts of all of the churches to merge in ecumenism. And they say, well, gee, why can't you all do what everybody else is doing? They don't do that. They show up once a week and they dance and they good and they come home and they're good. Why can't you do that? Like everybody else. And you have to explain sometimes, if I do what everybody else does, I'm going to get what everybody else gets. But as a consequence, even within the churches, they claim to all believe and love the same things, but they never discuss doctrine. Wonder why? Because the doctrines are so different. Leaving the lay member with no church-led sources of sound teaching, unless they actually live in a church and they attend a church where teaching is going on. The most striking but the simplest problem to solve here has been that the one that at one time it caused all kinds of strife here, it caused all kinds of problems here, but how would I get around it? Using the proper, and I did not say sacred, I used the proper names of the Father and the Son. Because understand, the mistake was born partly of anti-Semitism and partly out of simple scholarly error on the part of people believing themselves to be far more intelligent than they were shown by their translations. People dig in on either side of the argument and fight over whether or not you should say Jesus or whether you should say Yeshua, whether. We'll have a simple solution for that in about 5 minutes. Just hang in there. But people dig in on either side, and they refuse to hear the truth from the proper sources because they don't want to hear the truth. It's just like you used to hear talk about your mom. Oh, mama believed this, and Papa believed it, and Papa believed it, and great-granny believed it, and so-and-so believed it, and the founding fathers believed it. We won't even go there. And it must be okay. I mean, how can the whole world be wrong? But as always, King David put the concept in proper perspective. Let's go to Psalms 138, the first verse. Psalms 138th chapter, the first verse. A psalm of David. I will praise you with my whole heart. Because you probably have the gods, right? The proper translation would have been H430, which is Elohim. I will praise you with my whole heart before Elohim. I will sing praise to you. I will worship toward your holy temple and praise your name. Praise your name. But what is that name? Well, let's worry about that in a minute. I will praise your name for your loving kindness and for your truth's sake. Don't miss this. For you have magnified your word above your name. Whoa. He will always give you an answer. He will always give you an answer. In other words, so long as the truth is told about your works, your name will be known. I don't make a big stink if people want to use the name Jesus. Because most people are so biased against the Hebrew name that they don't realize that that in itself is a form of denial of the personage behind the real name. And the scholars ignore the error because it has been in play for so long, but I want you all to notice something. Even the King James translators got it goofy a couple of times. And they were wrong. Now, a lot of the translators say, oh no, you're trying to say that they were wrong about what they said. No, they did get the names mixed up. It didn't damage the content because most readers caught it and understood it, and even the translators got it right in later names, in later versions of the Bible. And I'll show you what I'm talking about. How many of you have a King James? Okay, now it gets interesting. But it doesn't change anything. This is what I'm talking about. You see, only atheists and critics believe that this invalidates the contents of the book. I don't. But it proves the correctness of the name. Let's go to Acts, the 7th chapter, the 43rd verse. Acts, the 7th chapter, the 43rd verse, where it says, yea, you took up the tabernacle of Moloch and the star of your god, Remphan, images which you made in order to worship them. And I will remove you beyond the Babylon. The tabernacle of witness was among our fathers in the wilderness as commanded by God. Now, notice they're talking about the wilderness. This was after Moses had been told you can't go into the promised land, and it was turned over to Joshua. Now check it out. The tabernacle of witness was among our fathers in the wilderness as commanded by God, speaking to Moses to make it according to the pattern that he had seen, which also having received by his inheritance with, what do you have? My point exactly. My point exactly. They didn't even know among themselves how to translate it. The proper name would have been Yeshua. And some of the newer versions now, that's what they have. But if you go back to the old King James, the 1611 version, the Geneva Bible, and some of those, it has just as big as life, I-E-S-O-U-S, Yeshua. Which a lot of people don't even know how to pronounce that properly in the Greek, because they don't realize that for every name, if you remember, that was transliterated from Hebrew to Greek, in order to make the S sound properly, they had to make them plural. So there was Kepha, became Kephas. Yeshu, that S had an SH sound, not Yesu. It was Yeshu, Yeshuas. That's the closest they could get to the proper name. So they went along with it. Now, of course, over time, that I-E-S-O-U-S, they maybe moved the grammatical part to make it sound like it was all one word, so all of a sudden it became Yeshu. And you go almost anywhere in the world, when you hear it, that's what you hear, Yeshu. So they automatically assume that you're saying Jesus. Not right, not correct. And they did it twice just to prove that they thought they got it right, which also, having received it by inheritance with Joshua, or you've got Jesus, our fathers with Joshua in taking possession of the nations whom God drove out before the face of our fathers until the days of David. Now, depending on your version, a few got it right. ASV got it right, BBE got it right, the American Standard Version got it right, the Bible Believers Version got it right, the New King James Version got it right, the New American Standard Version got it right. They all have Joshua, which is true. But the verse is speaking of Joshua of Nun, not Yeshua, as some have thought. This does not, as I said, devalue the script. It merely shows that somebody knew what they were doing when they translated that name IESOUS, that there was a plot afoot, if you will. What that plot was, I think it's pretty obvious now that it was to divide people. Whenever you see division, look for Satan, and you'll find him. Sometimes you don't have to look, he'll find you. Just act a little confused. And just to make sure, it did happen, however, one more time. Let's go to Hebrews, the 4th chapter, the 8th verse. Got quiet in here. Hebrews, the 4th chapter, the 8th verse, where it says, for if, what you got? Still talking about Joshua of Nun, but you see it happened again. For if Joshua had given them rest, then would he not oft afterward have spoken of another day? He is capitalized, so they're not talking about Joshua right there. They said if Joshua had given them rest, then would he, not he, speaking of Yahweh, not afterward have spoken of another day. There remaineth therefore a rest to the people of God. For he that is entered into his rest, he also has ceased from his own works, as God did from this. Again, most modern translations have corrected this to Joshua, as that is who the verse speaks of. Yet it is obvious that the older translators had an agenda. Notice, if you have an older King James, this interesting translation speaking of James's murder in Peter's capture by Roman soldiers. Let's go to Acts, the 12th chapter, the 3rd verse. It's little stuff like this people always, when you hear people talking about contradictions in the Bible, this is the kind of stuff they're talking about. You dig a little bit deeper and you find out that they're not contradictions, they're just little games that were played by the translators. Acts, the 12th chapter, the 3rd verse, where it says, and because he saw it pleased the Jews, he proceeded further to take Peter also. Then were the days of unleavened bread, and when he had apprehended him, he put him in prison and delivered him to 4 quaternions of soldiers to keep him intending after, what have you got? Hello? Now, to bring him forth to the people. Now, the proper Greek word here is G3957. Which in Greek is pasha. It's a neutered noun, transliterated from the Hebrew H6453, Pesach, H6453, which is Passover. Learn something new every day, don't you? It's little blurbs like this that prompt me to tell you all to continue to study and ferret these things out for yourself. Ask questions. We've got computers. We can look. We can check these things out and go through and find every reference it is and pull them all up and look at them. And that's how you find stuff like this. But what's more important, you find stuff like this and it doesn't shake your faith. It strengthens it. Because when you find the truth out, you find out that it still goes in a straight line. The yoke is still equal. You're still going in a straight line. Nobody's pulling you off to one side or the other side where you're not sure anymore. You're still sure of what the word says and who he's talking about. Now, because the answers that are coming from the world are getting more and more muddy every day. Unless you already have really great study helps and have done some work to understand these things, you're going to run into some problems that might make you doubt. As I said, lack of understanding engenders doubt. But as David said, if you know his word over the name, what does that mean? Question. Big question. Because the answer holds your eternity in your hands. Question. If the Antichrist or false prophet comes and says that it's okay to worship on either day and says his name is Jesus, what would that mark him as? What, somebody said it? What'd you say? Antichrist, absolutely. And would it be based on the name or would it be based on what came out of his mouth? Came out of what out of his mouth? Now, if this Antichrist comes in right now, says my name is whatever he says, whether it be Jesus or whether it be Yeshua. Now, after 3 years, he turns around and says that, okay, all you blokes, all who don't worship me and don't worship the idol that I've put in the temple, by my name, by the way, my name is Yeshua. But if you don't worship this idol, we're going to kill you. Who does that identify him as? Antichrist. I don't think we've done anything wrong here. We let you use the name you wanted to use and challenge you to understand what he said. That was my point. People left here because you're telling them that name. I said, we're telling them both. We're letting them use both, but we're using the right one to make a point. Not to say you're better than anybody else or smarter than anybody else. You use what you feel until you get to the point that you feel the right way about it. It's not about making people feel uncomfortable. It's about teaching them correctly. And sometimes there's going to be a little pain in that before you get to the truth. It just is what it is. It just is what it is. We will not be confused by the heresy that the world is confused by if we know the truth that the Bible teaches by. We don't have to worry about it. We've come too far to be dissuaded and turned around or confused about the prize that sits before us. We must become sure of this word of God and have no doubt about what it says. The letter of Paul to Timothy gives indication of what may come in the end, as Paul is sure, if you read him, that it's about over for him. 2 Timothy, the 4th chapter, the 2nd verse. We're almost done. 2 Timothy, the 4th chapter, the 2nd verse, where it says, preach the word. Be urgent in season and out of season. Reprove, rebuke, exhort with all long suffering and teaching, for the time will come when they will not endure sound doctrine, but having itching ears will heap to themselves teachers after their own lusts, and will turn away their ears from the truth and turn aside unto fables. But be you sober in all things. Suffer hardship. Do the work of an evangelist. Fulfill your ministry. For I am already being offered up, and the time of my departure has come. He knew. They almost caught me last week. It's just a matter of time before they catch me. Verse 7, I have fought the good fight. I have finished the course. I have kept the faith. Henceforth there is laid up for me the crown of righteousness, which the Lord, the righteous judge, shall give to me on that day. And not to me only, but also to all them that have loved his appearing. Give diligence to come shortly unto me, for Demas forsook me. See, it's already what's happening. They were selling each other out. For Demas forsook me, having loved this present world, and went to Thessalonica. Crescens to Galatia, Titus to Dalmatia. Only Luke is with me. In other words, the other ones have run. Take Mark and bring him with me, for he is useful to me for ministering. The others seem to be not so sure. But Tychicus I sent to Ephesus because they needed someone serious. The cloak that I had left at Troas with Carpus, bring when you come. And the books, especially the parchments. I'm still trying to write. I'm still trying to do things, and it's a little cold out here. Alexander the coppersmith did me much evil. Oh, don't talk about it. Don't talk about it. It just makes people. No, you got to sometimes point people out and say, this one's going to cause you problems. Steer around them. The Lord will render to him according to his works. No, he didn't say go get him. He said avoid him. Let God get him. This is his fight, not ours. The Lord will render to him according to his works. Of him do thou also be aware. For he greatly withstood our words. At my first offense, no one took part, but all forsook me. In other words, they've already dragged me in front of the courts, and I got out just by the will of God, because everybody else turned their backs on me. May it not be laid to their account. Whoa. That's strong. These people were going to kill him. They turned their backs on him so that the authorities could have him. And what did he say? Don't lay it to their charge. In other words, forgive them. That's huge to me. That's huge. 17. But the Lord stood by me and strengthened me, that through me the message might be fully proclaimed, and that all the Gentiles might hear. The main thing is the work, not me. And I was delivered out of the mouth of the lion. Whoa. The Lord will deliver me from every evil work and will save me unto his heavenly kingdom. I don't expect to live here, but I expect to see you again in the kingdom. To whom be the glory forever and ever. Amen. Salute Priscilla and Aquila and the house of Onesiphorus. Erastus remained at Corinth. He's right in the belly of the beast. But Trophimus I left at Miletus sick. Give diligence to come before winter. Eubulus salute you. And Pudens and Linus and Claudia and all the brethren, the Lord be with your spirit. In other words, these are ones that are already died. Be with your spirit. He didn't say be with you. He said be with your spirit. So he's listing the ones that have died on his watch. Grace be with you. Don't be so as to believe that some of us are going to come out of this physically alive if this thing goes down the way it has gone down through history. But do know this, that if we stay in the faith, we'll make it alive into the kingdom of God. And that's what's important at this point. God bless you all.